There are nights when the rain doesn't just fall, it remembers every broken promise, every silence stretched too long, every look that once meant love, now carrying weight like stones. On one such stormy night in Chicago, a woman stood trembling in the hallway of a luxury high-rise apartment, her nightgown clinging to her skin from the dampness in the air, a small suitcase at her feet, and a look of disbelief frozen on her face. The storm outside was relentless, but nothing compared to the storm within the Carter household that night. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor penthouse offered a haunting backdrop. Flashes of lightning over Lake Michigan lit up the polished hardwood floors and the marble counters she had once proudly chosen herself. Anna Brooks Carter, now barely holding herself together, looked up at her husband, David Carter, a man who once whispered forever into her ear beneath a church steeple. Just 3 years ago to the day, he wasn't whispering now. David, in his tailored shirt wrinkled from a long day and whiskey staining his breath, pointed toward the door. His voice, hoarse from rage and drink, cut through the sound of thunder like a blade. "Get out. Don't make me say it again, Anna." Anna blinked, as if trying to wake from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that had taken its time becoming real. That morning, she had still smiled, secretly touching her stomach, where 2 tiny heartbeats were just beginning to grow. She had spent the day preparing a dinner he once loved: rosemary chicken, scalloped potatoes, and lemon tarts. She had even wrapped a gift, a vintage watch he'd admired for years. The ribbon was gold. The box was blue. She had imagined tonight might bring them closer again, but that dream was already shattered. Behind David, just out of sight but not out of reach, stood Evelyn Carter, his mother. Her presence was like the scent of an old perfume that lingered long after the bottle was empty. Cold, composed, and cruel in her quietness, she had never welcomed Anna to Evelyn. Anna was a small-town girl with big city dreams and no pedigree to prove her worth. A woman who dared to love her son without asking permission first. And tonight, Evelyn was winning. David's accusations were unanchored, pulled from half-truths and twisted photos. His mother had likely arranged photos of Anna laughing with a male colleague at a coffee shop, a video cropped just so. Anna tried to explain. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "David, please, this isn't what you think. You know me." But the man before her wasn't the David she once knew. He had become a stranger, shaped by years of insecurity, resentment, and the ceaseless whispers of a mother who had long since turned his love into suspicion. With no more patience, David pulled her suitcase toward the door. Her gift box, still unopened, fell and rolled under the dining table. He didn't see it. He didn't care. The door slammed behind her with the finality of a verdict. The lock clicked, and with it, something within Anna broke. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. Her bare feet trembled against the cold tile. Outside, the storm showed no mercy, and neither did the man who once swore to protect her. She pressed one hand to her abdomen, whispering something no one heard, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a goodbye. She walked down that long corridor slowly, like someone leaving behind not just a home, but a history. The city stretched before her in a blur of lights and rain, and she had no destination, no plan. Just the twins growing inside her, and the last echo of a name she could no longer trust. Yet, even in that darkness, something began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something deeper: resolve. Because sometimes it takes the coldest nights to awaken the fire within. And that fire would not be easy to put out. As dawn began to push against the night, the world would soon see what Anna Brooks Carter was made of. But first, she needed a place to begin again. And in the quiet apartment of Grace Wallace, her childhood friend, now living on the city's south side, a new chapter, raw, broken, and uncertain, was just waiting to be written. There are many ways to lose a betrayal, distance. But for Anna, the sharpest blade wasn't David's anger. It was Evelyn Carter's silence. The kind that whispered louder than any scream. The kind of silence that crept into the corners of a home and rearranged the furniture of trust. Word by word, gesture by gesture. Evelyn had never approved of Anna. Not from the very beginning. Not when David brought her to the family's estate in Evanston. Her soft-spoken smile and calloused hands, reminding Evelyn too much of a life that wasn't polished, inherited, or passed through ivory halls. Anna was warmth. Evelyn was porcelain. And porcelain always cracks when the fire gets too close. On the surface, Evelyn played her role with perfection. She complimented Anna's cooking, then later told David it was a little too rustic. She praised Anna's patience only to suggest in private that she was a bit slow to mature. She gifted expensive crystal vases but insisted Anna didn't have taste enough to place them properly. And David, caught in the web between his wife and his mother, tried to be both protector and son. But some men never truly cut the cord. Some men let the mother still braid their choices, stitch their doubts, lace their tempers, and Evelyn had spent years weaving hers. She kept a close eye on Anna under the guise of concern. When Anna reconnected with college friends, Evelyn found it inappropriate. When Anna got a part-time job to feel productive, Evelyn called it a waste of time. When Anna laughed too loudly at someone else's joke, Evelyn noticed she always noticed. And then she began to act. It started with photos. Grainy, out-of-context snapshots of Anna at a coffee shop with her friend Marcusa, man she'd known for over a decade. Evelyn never asked. She simply printed the photo and left it in David's office drawer with a note that read, "I thought you deserved to know." David, already brewing with quiet insecurities, saw not a moment of friendship, but proof. Proof that his mother was right. That Anna might not be what she seemed. In private, Evelyn fueled the fire with concern, masked as kindness. "Sweetheart, I've seen the way she talks to him. Don't you think she's pulling away from you? Or worse, some women only want the name, the comfort, the security. Don't be naive." David resisted. At first, he loved Anna. But love that is not anchored becomes a sail in the wind. And Evelyn, she had mastered the wind. Over months, she painted a picture of Anna that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with fear. She didn't shout, she didn't command. She simply nudged. Over dinner, during walks, in voicemails left late at night when she knew he was alone. Evelyn didn't have to say, "Leave her." She just made it feel like the only logical outcome. But Evelyn didn't do it out of hate. No, her brand of destruction was colder than that. She did it because control was the only language she trusted. Because in her world, a good son does not belong to a woman not fully. In her world, a man does not choose love unless it is approved and orchestrated. She didn't hate Anna. She just needed her erased. And David let it happen. That night, when Anna was cast out, Evelyn didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice. She simply watched from the hallway. Lips pursed, arms folded like a queen overseeing the final act of a well-rehearsed play. When the lock clicked, her eyes didn't flinch. There was no guilt, no softness. Only the satisfaction of a battle won. But the price of manipulation is not paid in applause. It is paid in ghosts. And over the next few years, Evelyn would come to realize that the silence she once used as a weapon would become the very silence that haunted her home. David would spiral. The house would grow colder. And somewhere, far from that cold mansion, a woman was planting the seeds of a different legacy, one built not on control, but on survival. And in that distant place, beneath softer lights and unfamiliar streets, Anna Brooks Carter would make a decision, one that would reshape not just her future, but the lives of two children not yet born. Because if Evelyn Carter's greatest weapon was manipulation, then Anna's greatest power was resolve. And that resolve was about to carry her far away from everything that tried to break her. The rain didn't stop that night. It only grew colder. Anna stood in the shadow of the city, her suitcase soaked, her fingers trembling, one hand protectively clutching her stomach. The bright lights of downtown Chicago blurred behind her, through the misted taxi windows as she stared out at a world that had turned its back on her. She had nowhere to go. Her name was still on the lease of a home she could no longer enter. Her dignity, once quietly worn like a pearl, was now chipped and fragile, and inside her, two lives stood unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted. Grace Wallace lived on the south side, not in a penthouse, but a modest third-floor walk-up in an aging red-brick building where the stairs creaked and the heater coughed in winter. She and Anna had grown up in neighboring towns, went to the same small college in Iowa, and shared enough laughter in their youth to make the silences of adulthood a little easier to carry. Anna hadn't spoken to Grace in over a year, not because they had drifted, but because she'd been too wrapped up in trying to fix something that never wanted to be fixed. And yet, when she called, Grace answered on the first ring. She didn't ask questions, didn't need explanations. She just said, "Come." Anna arrived sometime after midnight. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed by betrayal and exhaustion. Grace opened the door without a word and folded her into an embrace that reminded Anna what it felt like to be held without judgment. No grand speeches, no shock, just warmth and a soft, "You're safe now." The apartment was small, just a living room. A bedroom Grace offered without hesitation, and a kitchen that smelled of lavender dish soap and overcooked pasta. But for Anna, It felt like a sanctuary. She sat by the window that night, wrapped in one of Grace's oversized cardigans, her bare feet tucked beneath her, staring out at the drizzle painting the glass. The city below moved on, as if nothing had happened. But Anna knew everything had changed. Her body was tired. Her mind was a maze of memories and regrets. She kept replaying David's face, not the one from that night, twisted with anger, but the one from the early days. The man who kissed her knuckles before sleep, who picked out paint samples with her on Sunday afternoons. Where had he gone? Or worse, had he ever been real? The next morning, Anna said little. Grace, sensing the heaviness in her friend's soul, didn't press. She made scrambled eggs, toasted 2 slices of rye, and poured orange juice into chipped mugs. Anna nibbled, more out of obligation than hunger. And then, when the silence stretched too long, she whispered, "I'm pregnant." Grace looked up, her face softening with a quiet kind of ache. "How far along?" 10 weeks. "Twins," Anna replied, her voice barely more than a breath. Grace reached across the table and took Anna's hand. There were no lectures, no questions, only the grip of sisterhood, the unspoken vow between women who have learned to survive in a world that sometimes forgets how easily it breaks them. The days that followed passed like a slow thaw. Anna remained mostly quiet, as if speaking too much might shatter the fragile safety she'd found. Grace went about her days, working at the local library, returning each evening with books, stories, little things to make the apartment feel less like a shelter and more like a home. She left sticky notes on the fridge until affirmations, like "You are stronger than this," or "Healing takes time. You don't have to rush." And yet, beneath the peace, Anna felt the pressure building. She couldn't stay here forever. She knew that. Grace would never ask her to leave. But Anna had always been the type to carry her own weight even when it threatened to crush her. Her thoughts turned constantly toward the babies inside her. What kind of life could she give them now? Where would she go? How would she begin? On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she found herself sitting on the floor, sorting through the few clothes. Grace walked in and paused at the doorway, watching her. "You don't have to figure everything out today," Grace said gently. "I know," Anna replied, folding a sweater. "But I need to start somewhere." And so, the thought began, a whisper in her mind, barely formed. Maybe she couldn't rewrite the past. Maybe she couldn't go back to who she was before that stormy night. But perhaps she could build something new, somewhere new. For herself, for her children. She didn't know yet where that would be. But deep down, something was shifting. A quiet defiance. A readiness not to fight, but to rebuild. And that readiness would lead her far from Chicago, far from David and Evelyn, and into a coastal town where the air smelled of salt and second chances. A town where broken women didn't stay broken, and where new lives could begin one stitch, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. In every woman's life, there comes a moment when silence becomes unbearable, when even the beating of her own heart feels too loud against the stillness of everything that's fallen apart. For Anna, that moment came one cold morning as sunlight cut through the blinds of Grace's apartment, landing on a small ultrasound photo taped above the nightstand. 2 tiny shadows, 2 growing heartbeats, and only one parent to carry them forward. The city outside was waking up, horns blaring, buses groaning, sidewalks filling with the rhythm of routine. But Anna sat frozen at the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of peppermint tea that had long since gone cold. Her mind, however, was on fire. Not with anger, but with questions. Where do you go when you no longer belong anywhere? How do you build a future with no foundation left to stand on? She had replayed every moment of that stormy night in her head, over and over, as if somehow by examining the ruins closely enough, she might find something worth salvaging. But there was nothing left there, not in David, not in Evelyn, not in that penthouse that had become a mausoleum for the version of herself she no longer recognized. And so, the decision began to form. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like dawn, slow and hesitant. Then suddenly, undeniable. She would leave Chicago. Not just the city, but everything tethered to it. The shadows, the judgments, the pity. She wouldn't raise her children in the echo of a home that once rejected their very existence. She would go somewhere far, somewhere no one knew her name. Somewhere she could be not the woman who was left behind, but the woman who chose to walk forward. That night, she sat across from Grace at the kitchen table. The lamp above them cast soft light onto 2 bowls of soup that had gone untouched. Anna's voice didn't shake. It was the calmest she'd felt in weeks. "I need to leave," she said. Grace didn't interrupt. I don't want to raise them. Here, not in the same air. Not near him. A beat passed. Then Grace nodded. Where will you go? I don't know yet. Just somewhere. Quieter, safer, warmer, maybe. Anna offered a faint smile, as if the idea of warmth itself felt like a luxury she had long forgotten. Over the next few days, they began to look at maps. Not the kind on glossy travel brochures, but practical maps, with rent estimates and school ratings and cost of living comparisons. Grace helped her sell the only piece of jewelry Anna had kept from her wedding, a silver bracelet engraved with her initials. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to start. They eventually settled on a town in North Carolina, by the coast, Wilmington. It wasn't flashy, but it was known for its peaceful neighborhoods, strong community programs for single mothers, and soft ocean breezes that carried more hope than noise. It felt like the right place for a beginning. Anna packed light 2 suitcases, a folder of medical documents, the ultrasound photo, and a journal filled with names she might one day give her children. She left a note for Grace on the pillow of the bed she'd been sleeping in, simply saying, "Thank you for being my lighthouse." At the Greyhound station, she held her stomach and whispered softly, "We're going to be okay." It wasn't a promise, it was a vow. The bus ride was long, the roads winding. The farther they got from Chicago, the more she began to feel herself returning not to who she was, but to who she might become. When the bus pulled into Wilmington just after sunrise, the coastal air greeted her like an old friend. It smelled of salt, possibility, and healing. She found a small apartment on the edge of town, 1 bedroom, a creaky floor, and a tiny balcony where she could hear the waves if she listened hard enough. The landlord was kind, an older widow named Mrs. Miller, who spoke softly and handed Anna a basket of cornbread on Moving Day without asking too many questions. It was exactly what she needed. Life didn't get easier overnight. The loneliness was real, the exhaustion relentless. But there was something deeply sacred about building something from nothing. She made every meal by hand, sewed baby clothes from thrifted fabric, attended prenatal appointments by herself, and each night she wrote letters to her unborn twins in the margins of library books, borrowed under a new name. She didn't miss David. What she missed was the illusion that, somewhere in the world, there had been safety in someone else's arms. Now, she knew better. Real safety came from within. Real strength didn't shout. It whispered in the dark. It held steady even when the lights went out. Her children would not grow up in fear. They would not learn love through the lens of manipulation. They would know softness and steadiness, and how a mother's courage can outgrow any betrayal. And one day, when they were old enough to understand, she would tell them not about the storm that ended everything, but about the morning she chose to walk out of the ruins and rebuild a life brick by brick. The ocean waited outside her window now, and just beyond that, the future, quiet, patient, and finally hers. The first winter in Wilmington was softer than the ones Anna had known in Chicago, but it carried a different kind of cold, the kind that crept in through loneliness rather than snow. She spent most days indoors, her belly growing, her hands restless. The apartment was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock above the stove and the occasional cry of seagulls beyond the window. In that quiet, something else began to stir, a hunger, not just to survive, but to create. Anna had always been good with her hands. Back in college, she'd patched up torn jackets and hemmed jeans for friends in exchange for coffee or notes from missed lectures. Her grandmother had taught her to sew on a Singer machine that still sat, unused, in her parents' attic back in Iowa. And now, surrounded by the hush of this new life, her fingers itched for that same kind of purpose. She started with bedsheets, flannel shirts from the thrift store, leftover ribbon that Mrs. Miller, her landlord, offered from a box of forgotten Christmas decorations. At first, she only intended to make a few things for the babies: swaddling blankets, soft bibs, onesies with hand-stitched initials. But as the needle moved beneath her fingertips, something else took shape. Not just fabric, not just clothes, a dream. It began one afternoon, when Mrs. Miller came by with fresh cornbread and spotted the tiny garments drying on the windowsill. The older woman, eyes misty, picked up a pair of booties and said, "These feel like love." A week later, she returned not with cornbread, but with a friend, a retired preschool teacher named Helen, who had a granddaughter due in May. Helen placed an order: 3 sets. All pastel, no rush, she said. Anna delivered them in brown paper with a ribbon. The next week, Helen came back with 2 more friends. And just like that, Ben and Sam's safe nest was born, named for the sons she had yet to hold. It was never meant to be a Business, it was a refuge. A way to pour all her tenderness, fear and hope into something she could hold. Each item she made was infused with care, buttons, double-stitched seams checked twice, fabric washed with the same soap she intended to use on her newborns. The small living room in her apartment turned into a workshop. The coffee table became a cutting station. The couch disappeared beneath rolls of cotton and thread. She listed her items on a local Facebook group for moms, offering to trade if someone couldn't afford them, blankets for diapers, bibs for formula. No one took advantage. In fact, many paid more than she asked. The community, gentle, ordinary, and full of quiet generosity, wrapped around her like a quilt. She was no longer just a stranger in town. She was the woman with the kind smile who made things by hand. The mother who had found her footing one stitch at a time. Of course, not every day was easy. There were moments when the pain of what she had lost surged like a rip current, unexpected and hard to swim through. Nights when the babies kicked, and she wished someone was there to feel it with her. But when those waves came, she sat at her sewing table, lit the small desk lamp, and let her hands remember what her heart couldn't yet say out loud. You're not broken, you're becoming. The brand grew quietly. One baby boutique in town agreed to carry her items on consignment. Then another across the bridge in Wrightsville Beach. Each label she sewed into her work bore the name of her sons, long before they ever opened their eyes. And so, in a modest apartment, above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and burnt toast, a mother rebuilt herself, not with grand gestures, but with tiny stitches of grace. Her sorrow became fabric, her fear became patterns, and her love, above all, became legacy. It was still early, and her belly grew heavier with each passing week. But Anna Brooks Carter had already begun building the world her children would be born into. Not the world she had escaped, but one crafted from resilience, community, and a quiet, enduring kind of joy. The town didn't know her story. Not yet, but soon it would. Because sometimes, the most beautiful revolutions begin not with a shout but with the hum of a sewing machine in the middle of a silent night. 8 years can pass in the blink of an eye, or stretch out like a long, quiet road, where every mile is a memory. For Anna Brooks Carter, those years were not measured in calendars or birthdays, but in stitches. In late nights lit by the glow of a sewing lamp. In the soft laughter of 2 growing boys chasing each other through the narrow halls of their modest home. In the gentle pride of seeing her work, once a simple act of survival, transform into something that carried its own name, its own story, its own legacy. Ben and Sam's safe nest had outgrown the corner of her living room. It now occupied a space on Main Street, just down the block from the bookstore and across from the farmer's market. The windows were lined with hand-sewn quilts, tiny jumpers, and hand-embroidered onesies hung on soft twine like art. Mothers and grandmothers came not just to shop, but to talk, to ask for advice, to share stories. The shop had become more than a boutique, it was a sanctuary. Anna, now in her mid-30s, moved through it all with quiet strength, her hair a little longer, her eyes steadier. She still carried her history in the lines of her face, but it no longer hurt to remember. She had stopped needing to explain why she had raised 2 boys alone. Wilmington had long accepted her without question. The woman who had once arrived with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart had become a fixture in the community, respected, admired, and most of all, trusted. Ben and Sam, now 7, were as different as the sun and the moon. Ben was quiet, bookish, with a curious mind and a habit of asking questions that sometimes took Anna by surprise. Sam was bold, full of energy, the kind of child who hugged tightly and laughed loudly. Together, they were the joy that carried her through every difficult moment. They knew she had built the store for them. They knew the name on the door meant they mattered, even before they were born. But they didn't know why their last name was just Brooks. Anna had never lied to them. She had simply chosen not to tell the whole story. She wanted them to grow up with light in their eyes, not shadows in their hearts. And so, when they asked about their father, she always answered with care. He couldn't stay. But that doesn't mean he didn't matter. A truth softened by love. A truth that left space for healing. The legacy she was building wasn't just made of fabric. It was made of boundaries, of choices, of the courage it takes to walk forward when the past keeps calling your name. She had been tempted, more than once, to look David up. To see what became of the man who once turned his back, not just on her but on the family they had nearly become. But every time the urge came, she turned instead to the present. A school, recital, a new product launch. The way Sam held Ben's hand at crosswalks without being asked. There were hard days. Still, days when the shop ran quiet, or when Sam got sick and the memory of doctor's bills reminded her how fragile everything still was. But even in those moments, Anna never felt alone. Because solitude, she had learned, was not the same as loneliness. Solitude was chosen. Solitude was sacred. It was the space where she had found her voice again. Her story had become a quiet legend in the town. The woman who came with nothing, built something beautiful, and never once asked for pity. Other single mothers came to her for advice. Young girls dropped by to ask about starting their own shops. Even the mayor's wife had placed an order last Christmas for 5 handmade quilts for her grandchildren, each with their names stitched into the border. Still, Anna never let success soften her. She remained humble. She greeted everyone the same with a warm smile, and the same question, "How can I help?" One Sunday evening, as golden light filtered through the shop's windows and the boys sat on the floor drawing spaceships, Anna found herself holding an envelope that had arrived in the mail. It was from a boutique in Raleigh, offering to carry her designs statewide. A big step, a good step. But as she looked at her boys, legs crossed and giggling over mismatched crayons, she realized that the size of her success wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that they were safe, they were loved, they were whole. Anna folded the letter and placed it in her notebook for later. Because life, she'd learned, doesn't always have to race forward. Sometimes the legacy you build is not about how far you go, but how gently you carry what matters most. The shop lights dimmed as the sun disappeared, and Anna called to the boys. "Come on, time for home." They stood, grinning, and each took one of her hands. 3 shadows passed across the window glass. Stepping into the evening together, tomorrow would bring more orders, more laughter, maybe even new beginnings. But tonight was enough, and just as they turned the corner, a phone would begin to ring long distance, from a hospital 3 states away. A name would be spoken, a connection would resurface, because some stories, no matter how well we tuck them away, are not quite finished. And this one was about to turn. It began as a cough soft dry, and barely worth noticing. Sam had always been the more energetic of the two. He ran faster, climbed higher, laughed louder. His scraped knees were like badges of honor, his bruises stories told in playground dirt. So when he came home from school, a little quieter than usual, Anna didn't worry. Kids get tired. Kids catch colds. But when the coughing lingered, then worsened when Sam began waking in the night, clutching his side and wincing as if something inside him had cracked. The unease settled into her chest like ice. She took him to the doctor, expecting an antibiotic, maybe some rest. Instead, they kept him for tests, then more tests, and then a doctor with tired eyes and a clipboard that felt far too heavy sat her down in a small consultation room, painted a color that pretended to be cheerful. He used phrases like significant concern, acute hepatic dysfunction, and finally, liver failure. The world tilted. Anna could still hear the fluorescent lights humming above her when the words "he needs a transplant" fell like stones from his mouth. Everything after that blurred. Dates, lab values, waiting lists, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was her son. Her son, her bright, wild, beautiful boy, whose body had turned against him. Ben, sensing the shift in the house, grew quieter too. The boys had never spent a night apart. But now Sam was in a hospital bed, with wires like vines crawling up his arms. And Ben sat at the window every evening, staring out at the sea, asking questions Anna didn't yet know how to answer. She stayed by Sam's bedside, her hand always on his, her eyes always on the machines. She read him books, hummed lullabies, and whispered stories about when he was in her belly, how he used to kick every time she laughed. He smiled weakly, but his skin turned yellower by the day. His eyes lost their light, and Anna, for all her strength, began to crumble inside. She asked about donor lists. The waiting time was months too long. She asked about alternatives. Living donors were possible, but only if there was a match, a close relative, a biological parent. And just like that, the wall she had so carefully built around the past began to shake. For the first time in 8 years. She said David's name out loud. She hadn't spoken of him since the day she left Chicago. Not to friends, not to the boys. She had buried that part of her life so deeply, she could hardly believe it still existed. But now it rose, unforgiving, sharp, and inescapable. David Carter was the boy's father, and his blood might be the only thing that could save their son. Anna stood outside the hospital that night as the waves crashed faintly in the distance. Her breath came in shallow pools. She wanted to scream, to run, to undo the very biology that tied her children to a man who had once chosen silence over love. But she could single quotes. Because now, love meant doing the unthinkable. It meant opening old wounds. It meant reaching into the fire again, knowing she might get burned all over. Back in Sam's room, he slept with a stuffed penguin tucked beneath his arm, one Anna had sewn when he was just a baby. She touched his forehead and made a vow, one louder than fear and stronger than pride. I will do whatever it takes. And so, Anna began the search. She didn't know where David was. He had disappeared from public life years ago. There were no recent photos, no social media, no listed address, but the internet leaves breadcrumbs, and desperation sharpens the senses. She found a former business partner, then a law office that had once handled his real estate, a P.O. box in Indiana, then, finally, a phone number disconnected twice, but reactivated just weeks ago. She called. It rang 4 times before someone answered, a man's voice. Older now, worn. Hello. Anna didn't speak right away. Her throat closed, her past catching up to her in a single word. David, she finally said. It's Anna. Silence. Then Anna, she exhaled. I need your help. It's about your son. There was no anger in her voice. No accusations. Just truth. Just a mother clinging to the last thread of hope. Because the next chapter wasn't going to be about pride. It wasn't going to be about blame. It was going to be about whether a man who once walked away was willing to return when it mattered most. And somewhere, on the other end of that fragile phone line, a long-buried conscience began to stir. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Older, weathered in a way that didn't come from age alone. Anna. She hadn't heard her name spoken like that in years. Like it still carried weight. Like it still echoed in someone's memory. She closed her eyes and steadied her breath. It's about Sam, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Our son. He's very sick. There was a pause. Not the kind that came from shock, but the kind that followed the sudden cracking of a wall, built too high, too long. I didn't know I had a son, David finally said, let alone Sam. Anna felt the sting of old hurt rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. This moment wasn't about punishment. It was about survival. He's 7, she said. He needs a liver transplant. You're likely a match. He wouldn't be calling if it wasn't life or death. Silence again, but this time, it trembled. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside a run-down duplex in Gary, Indiana. The paint peeled from the shutters. The mailbox was rusted. The yard unkempt. The man who once lived in penthouses and wore custom suits now lived in the kind of neighborhood where Hope had moved out years ago. He opened the door slowly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. David Carter was a shadow of the man Anna once knew. His face was drawn, his shoulders hunched, and his once confident gait was replaced by a tired shuffle. The alcohol was in his breath, though not fresh. More like a ghost that still lingered. His eyes, those were the same. Regretful, searching you look. He started, then stopped himself. I look like a mother with too little sleep, and too much to lose, Anna said. Can we talk? He stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was dim, cluttered, filled with the stale scent of forgotten days. A sink of unwashed dishes. Bills piled on a dusty counter, and above the fireplace a framed photo of Evelyn Carter, long since passed, her stare still cold even in print. She died 3 years ago, David said, noticing her gaze. Cancer. Quick. Quiet. Anna said nothing. There was nothing to say. He sat down, his hands folded between his knees. Tell me everything. And she did. She told him about the pregnancy, the night she left the twins, about Ben and Sam, and the life she had built with her own 2 hands. She didn't dwell on his absence. She didn't need to. Her silence about it was louder than any accusation. When she finished, David sat there, his knuckles white, staring at the floor. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Anna replied. Just come, get tested. If you're not a match, we'll keep looking. If you are, it's his only chance. He nodded. I will. The next morning, they drove in silence to the hospital. He watched the sea as they neared Wilmington, blinking as if the brightness of the sky burned his memory. When they arrived, Anna led him down long white corridors filled with antiseptic and the faint buzz of machines. Sam was asleep when they entered. His face was pale, his little chest rising and falling too slowly. David stopped at the door. His hands trembled. Can I? He asked. Anna nodded. He stepped forward and dropped to one knee beside the bed. "Hi, Sam," he whispered. "I'm your dad." Sam didn't stir. But in that moment, something shifted. David reached out and touched his son's hand gently, reverently, like someone touching a sacred thing they never believed they were worthy of. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he said, barely audible. Anna stood in the doorway, watching a moment unfold that was years too late, but still, somehow, not too far gone. This wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something raw and honest. The doctors ran tests. Blood was drawn. Matches confirmed. David was eligible. That night, Anna sat alone outside the hospital, on a bench facing the sea. The wind tugged at her coat. Her hands were cold. She had hoped never to see David again. She had trained herself to live without him, to erase him from the chapters of her life. But fate, merciless, poetic fate, had brought him back, not as a husband, not even as an apology, but as a lifeline. And now, for the first time in years, she was forced to hope again, not for love, but for mercy. In a few days, David would go under the knife, not to fix the past, but to save the future. And Anna, weary and wide awake, would sit by her son's side waiting, praying, holding space, not just for healing, but for what comes after. Because even if a man comes back in pieces, if he brings life in his hands, sometimes you let him in, just enough to save the child you'd do anything for. The morning of the transplant consultation, the hospital waiting room, was unusually still. Sunlight streamed through tall glass panes, casting long rectangles on the pale linoleum floor. Nurses passed by in quiet rhythm, and across from the reception desk, David Carter sat rigid in a plastic chair, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. He hadn't said much since the blood match confirmation the night before. Just nods, deep breaths, and stares into nowhere. Anna sat beside him, silent, focused on the clipboard in her lap. She was reviewing post-op instructions, but her thoughts were miles away. Ben was due to arrive soon with Grace, and she wasn't sure how if she should prepare David for what he was about to see. He knew about Sam now. He had touched his son's hand, signed the consent forms, even spent a night at the hospital, sitting in the dark like a ghost, waiting to be reborn. But he didn't know there was another child, another boy who shared Sam's face, his laugh, his blood. Anna had kept the truth tucked away for years, not out of spite, but out of protection. From a past too jagged to revisit, from a father who'd chosen to disappear. But now, that past was walking straight toward the glass doors of the hospital, holding Grace's hand, wearing a blue hoodie and sneakers too big for his feet. Ben. When the doors hissed open, David barely noticed. It wasn't until he heard Grace's soft voice say, "Anna, we're here," that he looked up, and then he froze. It was like seeing Sam walking and talking, in real time only. This child was awake, vibrant, curious, the same soft jawline, same sharp brown eyes. A mirror. David stood slowly, blinking as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Ben looked up at him, puzzled, but not fearful. "Hi," he said. "Are you the man helping Sam?" David didn't answer. Anna gently rose and placed a hand on Ben's back. Her voice was calm. "Ben, this is ... David. He's your father." There was a pause. A wait. Ben tilted his head. "But I thought, you said our dad left a long time ago." Anna crouched beside him. "I did. But sometimes, people find their way back when it matters most. And he's here now, to help Sam." Ben looked at David again, this time longer. Then, in the most matter voice a child could manage, he said, "You look tired." David let out a breath that caught in his throat. Then, without warning, he sat back down, covered his face with his hands, and began to sob. Not the kind of tears born from guilt alone, from collision. 8 years of silence, of ignorance, of choosing escape over responsibility, now collapsed into one overwhelming truth. He hadn't just abandoned a wife. He had walked away from 2 sons. Anna didn't move to comfort him. Not yet. This was his moment to break, and some men need to break before they can begin again. Grace quietly led Ben to the end of the hall, offering space. Anna sat down beside David, who was still shaking, hands clutched, like a man drowning in himself. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked through tears. She looked straight ahead, voice even. Would it have made a difference? He didn't answer. Had to choose between waiting for the man who left, she continued, or becoming the mother they needed. "I chose them." David wiped his face, nodding slowly. "I deserved that." "No," Anna said. "They didn't." Her words weren't cruel. They were steady, clear, like a woman who had spent too many nights sewing blankets for boys, who never asked why their father wasn't there. David leaned back against the wall. They're beautiful. Both of them I missed. I missed so much. And yet, Anna said softly, you're here now. He looked at her, eyes red. I want to be a part of their lives. We'll take it one step at a time, she replied. But first, we focus on Sam. David nodded. That afternoon, he sat, with both boys, one awake and full of questions, one sleeping under the weight of illness. For the first time, a fractured family shared the same room. Not whole, not healed, but finally present. As Anna stood outside the room, watching her sons draw on the hospital tray table, while David leaned in to listen, something inside her began to loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a small unraveling of bitterness. Because sometimes, when the truth finally arrives, no matter how late, it has the power to break a man down. And if he's willing to stay broken long enough, he might just learn how to build something real. Tomorrow, David would lie on an operating table to save a boy he had only just met. But today, he had met himself for the first time in years. And that, in itself, was a kind of surgery too. The morning of the surgery was still and pale, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Sam lay prepped in a quiet hospital room, his small frame tucked beneath a blanket, eyes flickering between sleep and awareness. In the neighboring room, David sat in a surgical gown, an IV taped to his arm, heart pounding not from fear of the procedure, but from something far older, far deeper. For the first time in his life, David Carter had chosen to stay, to show up, to sacrifice, and that decision alone had already begun reshaping the man he thought he'd become. But not everyone was ready to let him change. Shortly before the surgical team arrived, Anna's phone buzzed, a number she hadn't seen in years. She didn't answer. A minute later, the front desk called to inform her someone was demanding to see David. And before she could intervene, Evelyn Carter, older, thinner, but no less composed, walked into the hallway like a storm wrapped in silk. Anna froze. She hadn't seen Evelyn since the night she'd been pushed out of that Chicago penthouse like yesterday's regret. The woman who had orchestrated her exile now stood just feet away, as if time hadn't moved, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Evelyn's eyes scanned the hospital floor with disdain. Where is he? She asked, voice low, clipped, the same tone she'd once used to shame Anna into silence. They said he's undergoing surgery. What kind of madness is this? Anna stepped in front of her, calm and firm. He's donating part of his liver to his son. Evelyn blinked. His what? His son Sam. And he has another Ben. It took a moment for the weight of those words to register, and when they did, Evelyn's face twisted. Not with shock but with something worse. Control slipping through her fingers. This is absurd, she snapped. David's not in any condition to make that kind of decision. He's unstable. Youth, this is your manipulation. Again. I should have known. Anna didn't flinch. She'd spent 8 years becoming a woman who no longer shattered under blame. I didn't ask him to come, she said. He came because he wanted to, because he's their father, and because Sam might not make it without him. Just then, a voice echoed from down the hall, weak but steady. Mom. Evelyn turned. David stood at the doorway, dressed in hospital whites, pale but resolute. There were no doctors holding him up, no alcohol on his breath, no fear in his voice. Go home, he said. She stepped forward, lips pursed. David, you don't know what you're doing. You're letting that woman. He held up his hand. No, don't call her that. Her name is Anna, and she raised our sons alone. While I drank myself into a corner and let you run my life. Not anymore. Evelyn's mouth opened, but David didn't let her speak. I let you tell me who to love. I let you ruin a marriage I should have fought for. I let you convince me that Anna was less than, that our life together wasn't worth saving. And I believed you, because it was easier to blame her than to face the truth about myself. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the strain of cutting cords that had bound him his whole life. But I'm done. The hallway went still. Evelyn looked at him, searching for the obedient boy she'd raised. The one who had always apologized, always nodded, always backed down. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man about to surrender a piece of his body to save a child he barely knew, but already loved. David took a step closer. You're not welcome here. Not today. Not during this. Evelyn stared at him, her face hardening, then turned to Anna, eyes full of cold fire. This isn't over. Anna met her gaze without fear. It already is. Without another word, Evelyn turned and walked away, her heels echoing against the tile floor, like the final notes of a bitter symphony. David exhaled deeply. He leaned against the doorframe, drained but lighter than he'd felt in years. Anna walked toward him, not to comfort but to stand beside him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Double quotes. "Yes, I did," he replied. "That was the surgery I needed first." Moments later, the nurses arrived to take him in. As they wheeled him toward the OR, Anna placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you." He looked up, tired but calm. "I'm just trying to make something right." Then he disappeared behind the double doors, and Anna returned to Sam's room, her heart full of ache, but also of something she hadn't felt in years, not forgiveness, but the quiet beginning of it. Because sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't begin on an operating table. It begins when a son finally tells the truth to the parent who once taught him how to lie. In the soft hum of the hospital's surgical wing, time seemed to bend. David Carter lay on the operating table, draped in sterile sheets, eyes closed beneath the blur of anesthesia. Monitors beeped steadily, fluorescent lights glared above, and a team of surgeons worked with quiet urgency. Part of his liver, still healthy despite years of wear and drink, was being prepared for transplant into the fragile, 7-year-old body of a boy he had only just met. But in that room, biology and regret made peace with one another, if only for a few sacred hours. Down the hallway, Anna sat beside Sam, her hand resting lightly over his. He looked impossibly small. Tubes wrapped around his wrist, monitors tracing every heartbeat, every breath. The nurses had told her to sleep, to eat, to take a break, but she couldn't leave him. Not now. Not when everything depended on a man she once trusted, once loved, and once had to survive without. She watched the steady rise and fall of Sam's chest. It was all she could do. Time passed like fog, slow and heavy. In the recovery unit, David's eyes fluttered open to the glow of afternoon light slipping through half-shuttered blinds. Pain gripped his side like fire, but beneath it all was something strange. Stillness. Not numbness, not medication, but a kind of stillness he hadn't known in years. As if something inside him had finally found its place. Anna entered the room. A few hours later, she didn't rush to his side. She didn't cry. She simply pulled up a chair and sat in silence beside him. He turned his head slowly. "Is he?" "He's stable," she said softly. "They say the next 48 hours are critical, but it looks promising." David let out a breath that trembled on the edge of relief. Good. They sat like that for a while. The silence not awkward, but earned. It was the kind of silence two people share when the anger has burned away, and only the ashes of understanding remain. Anna looked at him not as the man who broke her, or even the man who returned, but as someone else entirely. A man in the process of becoming. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You could have walked away again." "I thought about it," David admitted, "at first. But when I saw him, when I saw Ben, I realized what I'd missed, and I couldn't keep missing it." "You almost died," she whispered. "Maybe I needed to come close," he replied, eyes misting. "To remember what's worth living for." Anna looked down at her hands. "They don't know yet, not fully, about everything." "I'll tell them," he said. "When the time is right. I'll tell them everything." She nodded. In the days that followed, Sam slowly opened his eyes. Weak smiles returned. Nurses began lowering the pain meds, and the bruises around the surgical site faded like old memories. David, though slow to move, sat longer each day reading to Ben, watching cartoons beside Sam's bed, sometimes just listening to the boys argue over which superhero was cooler. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was real. One afternoon, Anna found David in the hospital courtyard, walking laps around the fountain, ivy pole in tow. He looked thinner, paler but also lighter somehow, like a man who had dropped a lifetime's worth of weight at the edge of a single choice. She walked beside him. No words, just steps. "I used to think strength meant keeping everything in," he said finally. "But now I think it's about showing up when it hurts." Anna looked at him. "You showed up? I don't expect anything from you," he added. "I know I broke too much to ask for forgiveness, but I want to be there. For them. For the small things. Baseball games. School recitals. Bedtime stories. Even if I sit in the back row." She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the trees above them. A bird landed on the fountain's edge. And then, with a voice barely more than a breath, she said, "One step at a time." David nodded. He could live with that. That hospital stay came to an end 2 weeks later. Sam was well enough to go home. David too. The staff gathered for goodbyes, many wiping away tears they didn't expect to cry. It wasn't just a surgery they had witnessed, it was something more. A family finding its pieces again. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but piece by piece, gently, with room for healing. As Anna packed up Sam's things, and Ben helped fold blankets into the tote bags, David stood by the door, watching the three of them. He didn't step forward, he just waited. Quiet, open, unsure, and then, Sam reached for his hand. That was enough. Together, they stepped into the sun. There would be more conversations ahead, more questions, more explanations, but also, more mornings, more dinners, more laughter echoing through a house that had once held only the sound of a sewing machine, humming alone in the dark. This wasn't the end, it was finally the beginning. The hardest part about healing isn't the pain, it's the silence that follows. After the hospital released them, the house felt too quiet. The boys, still under gentle restrictions, no longer ran through the halls like wild summer wind. Anna found herself checking their breathing at night, her palm hovering just above Sam's chest, unable to shake the fear that something might still go wrong. It was strange how trauma lingered, even after the worst had passed. Like a shadow that followed you even in sunlight. David didn't go back to Indiana. He found a small apartment a few blocks from Anna's house, 1 bedroom. Second floor, with creaky wooden steps and a tiny balcony that overlooked a crooked oak tree. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to show he wasn't retreating. Enough to say, I'm here now. He didn't ask to stay with them. Didn't push for family dinners or second chances. Instead, he showed up in small ways. He walked Ben to school on Tuesdays. Picked up Sam's prescriptions when Anna was working late at the shop. Sat in the back row during the boys' reading circle at the library. Without saying a word. It was awkward at first, especially for the boys. Sam still asked careful questions. Ben watched him with quiet eyes, measuring everything. But over time, the curiosity softened. David didn't try to be their father in a sweeping, dramatic sense. He didn't try to erase the years he missed. He just listened. And kept showing up. Sometimes, redemption is not a grand gesture, it's the quiet choice to stay. Day after day. Anna watched all of it unfold, like someone watching a tree grow. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but something inside her recognized the shift. The boys began including David in drawings they made. My family, they wrote in crayon, sometimes awkwardly squeezing his stick figure in the corner, but always drawing him closer. He joined her once at the shop on a rainy Saturday, just to help carry boxes in from the back. He didn't say much, just unpacked in silence, letting his actions speak in a language more honest than anything he could have said. She offered him coffee, and for the first time in years, they shared it across the same counter, not as a couple, not as enemies, but as two people finally looking forward, instead of back. Still, not everything was fixed. The wounds were deep. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight. There were moments when Anna woke from old dreams, heart pounding, reminded of who he had been. Moments when David caught himself pulling back out of habit, as if he still didn't believe he deserved to stay. But the difference now was this. Neither of them ran. When the past crept in, they faced it together, quietly, without blame. Grace, ever the anchor, watched with careful joy. You don't owe him anything, she once told Anna. But if the boys are happy, and your heart is calm, maybe that's worth something. And it was. It truly was. On the first warm day of spring, they all went to the beach together. Ben built lopsided sandcastles. Sam chased seagulls in slow bursts of laughter. David carried a cooler filled with sandwiches and apple slices. Anna sat on a blanket with her feet in the sand, the sunlight catching in her hair. At one point, Sam ran back, a small shell in his hand. "Mom," he said breathlessly, "this one's for you. It's not perfect, but I think it's beautiful." She took it, turning the worn edges over in her palm, and smiled. "I think so too." She looked up at David's shirt sleeves rolled, hair tousled by wind, a little sunburn on his cheeks from not thinking to bring a hat. "I think we're all learning how to be whole again," she said. He nodded, not as a promise, but as a man, grateful just to be standing on the shore. Sometimes, healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives softly, disguised as routine. In the way a child reaches for your hand without hesitation. In the quiet moments between laundry loads and bedtime. Stories, in the trust that slowly grows back. Not because it was demanded, but because it was earned. This was their new chapter. Still tender, still healing, but more real than anything that had come before. And in the background, the waves rolled in gentle, steady, forgiving If Anna was the heart of the family, then Ben and Sam were its rhythm, the pulse that kept everything alive, even in the darkest moments. They had been together from the start. Two souls formed side by side, nestled beneath the same heartbeat, kicking in tandem before they ever saw the world. But as they grew, it became clear they were not just twins. They were each other's balance. Ben, quiet and thoughtful, always seemed to notice the world in ways others missed. He saw patterns in clouds, remembered things people said weeks ago, and had a way of asking questions that stopped you in your tracks. Sam, in contrast, was energy in motion, curious, bold, always a step ahead of himself. Where Ben paused, Sam leapt. Where Sam scattered, Ben gathered. And somehow, in the chaos of recovery, of rebuilding, of learning how to live with a father who had reappeared like a half-forgotten melody, it was their bond that held the whole family steady. Sam's illness had shaken them all, but it had cracked something open in Ben. For weeks, he had sat beside his brother's hospital bed, with a book in hand, reading out loud, even when he wasn't sure Sam could hear him. He had drawn pictures of the two of them as astronauts, explorers, superheroes, always side by side, always surviving. When Sam had cried in pain, Ben didn't flinch. He held his hand and whispered, "It's okay, I'm right here," like a mantra he believed more than anything else in the world. And when Sam finally began to heal, it was Ben's joy that filled the house first. He followed Sam from room to room, offering snacks, building Lego cities, letting Sam win at board games just because he could. David, watching from a quiet corner, often found himself overwhelmed by what he'd nearly missed. He had expected two boys. He hadn't expected a bond so deep it felt sacred. Watching them, he began to understand. His return wasn't just about making peace with Anna or earning her trust. It was about being worthy of the love that already existed between two children who hadn't needed him to become whole, but who welcomed him anyway. There was one evening that made it all real. It was late spring. The sun had dipped low, and the boys were out back, barefoot in the grass, chasing fireflies. Anna sat on the porch with a cup of tea, and David stood a few feet away, watching. Sam ran toward Ben, firefly cupped in his hand. He opened his fingers, slowly, and whispered, "Look, we caught it together." Ben smiled, not at the light but at his brother. "We always do," he said. Later that night, as David tucked them into bed for the first time, Sam reached up and touched his father's arm. "Are you staying tomorrow too?" David's voice cracked just slightly. "Yeah, bud. I'm not going anywhere." Ben rolled over in his blanket and added, "You don't have to be perfect. Just be here." And in that small room, lit only by a nightlight shaped like a moon, something unspoken shifted. The boys didn't know the full story of what came before, but they knew what mattered now. It wasn't about the past. It was about presence. Anna stood in the hallway, her hand on the doorframe, listening. And in that moment, for the first time since she walked out of that Chicago penthouse with a suitcase and an unborn future, she let herself believe that this messy, beautiful, unfinished life was exactly enough. The next morning, the boys woke early and pulled David outside to the front yard. They had decided it was time to plant a tree. A tiny sapling they had picked out from the nursery, thin, fragile, needing care. "We'll water it every day," Sam said. "And in a few years," Ben added, "it'll be strong like us." David smiled, and with dirt on his hands and sunlight on his shoulders, he helped them lower the tree into the ground. And as they patted down the soil, Anna stood at the porch, watching her family, not a picture of perfection, but of love that had been earned the hard way. Sometimes, it's the smallest bonds that rebuild the biggest broken things. And in the laughter of two boys who never let go of each other, a father had found his reason to stay. Forgiveness doesn't arrive like a trumpet. It doesn't knock loudly or come wrapped in declarations. More often, it slips in like dusk, soft, slow, unnoticed until the light has already changed. For Anna, forgiveness had always felt like a distant shore. She never imagined she'd reach it, not after the night she was left behind. Not after the silence, the years, the single mother tears spilled into cold pillows, while her son slept peacefully in the next room. She hadn't chased it. She hadn't needed it to survive. She had built a life without it. But one evening, in late summer, standing at the edge of the beach where the boys now ran with their father through the shallows, yelling, unburdened, felt something soften inside her chest. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply, ... peace. David walked back toward her, panting slightly, holding a towel in one hand and a plastic bucket in the other. His shirt was soaked, his face flushed from sun and effort. He looked more like the man she once fell in love with than he ever had in the last decade. But it wasn't nostalgia that moved her. It was the stillness in his gaze, the humility, the steadiness of a man who had stopped running from himself. He handed her the towel with a shy smile. "I'm not as fast as I used to be," she smirked. "You were never fast." They both laughed. He sat beside her in the sand, brushing the edge of his shoe against the shells. The boys were now farther down the beach, building forts and telling stories only twins could understand. A golden light fell over the horizon, stretching long shadows behind them. The air smelled of salt and fading summer. David turned to her, unsure, but needing to speak. "I know I've said it already, but thank you for letting me be here, for not slamming the door." Anna looked at him, her voice calm. "You didn't earn it overnight. I know. It wasn't for you," she added. "It was for them. They deserved a chance to know their father." He nodded. "I'm still learning how to be one." "You're doing okay," she said. Silence passed between them, not awkward, but full of everything they once were, everything they could never be again, and everything they had become because of the boys. Because of time, because life, somehow, keeps unfolding. And then, without warning, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small object. A familiar box, weathered at the corners, wrapped in a faint gold ribbon. He recognized it instantly. "This was your anniversary gift," she said. "I never threw it away. I don't know why." He opened the box slowly. Inside was the watch he'd once admired in a storefront window years ago. A classic design, clean face, brown leather band, timeless, elegant. "I should have worn this years ago," he said. She smiled gently. "It wouldn't have meant anything back then." He looked up. "And now?" She didn't answer right away. She let the question sit. Then finally, with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths behind her, she said, "Now, I think it does." David swallowed hard. "Does this mean you forgive me?" Anna turned her face toward the sea, her eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun. "I think ... I already have." It wasn't said as a gift to him. It wasn't a romantic conclusion or a grand finale. It was something for her, a release, a letting go, not forgetting but choosing no longer to carry the weight, because forgiveness, at its core, isn't about who hurt whom or who deserves what. It's about freedom. She stood and called out to the boys. Time to head back. They came running, full of laughter and salt water and sand in their hair. David rose too, brushing the watch gently against his wrist before slipping it on. It fit perfectly. They walked together toward the Carrefour shadows, stretching along the shore. Not a perfect family, but a whole one, in their own way. And in that final golden light, Anna realized something she hadn't dared believe for years. You can survive without forgiveness, but you only start to truly live with it. And on that quiet evening, as the tide rolled in behind them, they all began again.